Welcome to the next edition of Grid Pulse. I'm Bryce Yonker with Grid Forward. Today we have two fantastic guests with us, Christopher Knittel and Ryan Hledick. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on.
Thanks, Bryce.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to cover the kind of ever important topic, but maybe all the more so these days, on grid affordability. I appreciate you two gentlemen joining. It's kind of a hot button issue these days. So maybe we'll just start with some quick introductions. Ryan, if you don't mind, I'll let you say how many years you've been there at Brattle if you want, but if you can just do a quick introduction, that'd be great.
It's hard for me to keep track, but LinkedIn reminds me every year. That's how I know. So yeah, great to be with you. Ryan Hledick. I've been with Brattle for 20 years. I'm a principal here, focused on all of the kind of exciting stuff that's happening on the customer side of the meter, and electricity prices and customer bills are a big focus of all of that work. So looking forward to talking about this.
Great. And Professor Knittel, we're going to go by Christopher, if that's all right for you.
Sure.
I saw you've been there at MIT for some time, so if you can do a quick background, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm older than both of you, but so I won't tell you when I started. So I'm Chris Knittel. I'm a professor of applied economics in the Sloan School of Management here at MIT. And I also direct two centers on campus, one called the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, and the other being the MIT Climate Policy Center.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, thanks for being on. I guess we'll start with Christopher, with you on this one. It almost feels like all corners of the electric grid right now are talking about affordability. Why is this the topic right now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is just affordability generally across the entire economy is a big topic. We just saw 4% inflation yesterday come out. So general prices have been increasing for quite some time. If we dive deep into the electricity sector has been growing faster than the rate of inflation. So it's been going up even faster. But I think the other reason why there's been a lot of focus on electricity prices is we're trying to electrify things, and we're actually trying to grow electricity demand. And we're seeing growth in electricity demand after decades of very flat demand growth. So everything's kind of pointing at the electricity industry for that reason. And of course, if you're growing demand and prices are going up, that can be a problem.
What I would add to Chris's comments is that we're also seeing different portions of the U.S. population being impacted differently. Lower income customers, I think, are feeling this hit harder than other customers are. And so that income disparity consideration is an important piece of this as well.
Well, that was going to get to my second question. Maybe you can keep this thread going, Ryan. Price increases are not the same everywhere, and I mean that by customer classes as well as geographic locations. What places or populations are seeing the higher increases?
Sure. I mean, if you think about just customer segments, residential, commercial, and industrial, we have seen residential rates increasing faster than commercial and industrial rates. There could be several reasons for that. I think one of the big drivers is on a per kilowatt hour basis. Residential customers tend to be heavier users of the distribution system. Distribution costs have been increasing for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into. So that portion of the bill in particular, I think, is growing faster for households than it is potentially for commercial and industrial customers. So let's get to the customer segmentation question. In terms of geography, we have seen rates rising in California in particular, and other Western states, particularly recently. A big driver of that is the cost of wildfire risk mitigation. But it is a very regional issue, and there are different drivers for rate increases across different parts of the country.
So, Christopher, I'll kick this one to you. By affordability, I mostly mean, what customers pay for power, right? A kilowatt hour or at least their total bill. But, how would you think about affordability? And, maybe a little bit further on Ryan's, how are the customer types being impacted, maybe somewhat differently?
Yeah, I think Ryan brought up a great point about the different types of customers, and even if we zoom in on residential, energy generally is a very regressive product. So low income households spend more of their income as a percentage of their income on energy than higher income households. So when the price of energy goes up, it's obviously going to hit low income households a lot more than if the price of TVs goes up or the price of cars go up. So I think that is a great point about why this is so important. And what we're seeing is just that we wrote a paper that published in 2024 that measured energy poverty across the US. And energy poverty is defined as you spend over 6% of your income on energy. And what we're seeing in the data is that energy poverty is growing just generally, and also tends to be moving from the northern part of the US to the south as air conditioning becomes more important and as climate is continuing to change.
So Ryan, maybe a little further on that energy burden topic. It seems to be increasing. You mentioned low-income customers earlier. Do you have any other figures or facts off the top of your head right now as far as where things are going and where they're at right now?
The only other thing I guess I would add to this is, on average, looking back at some of the research that we did on this topic with LBNL recently, Ryan Weiser was the kind of the key person at the lab who was leading a lot of this research. What we saw was, up until just the last maybe year or two, on average, expenditures on electricity were decreasing as a share of household income. So that was a positive story that could be told. That trend changed between 2024 and 25. We saw kind of a tipping point, and that started to increase. So that's some added context. But again, that average does mask the point that Chris and I both just made a second ago, which is that is not a beneficial outcome that all customers are observing together.
And maybe just as a baseline, what are we talking about for rate increases? I mean, I've seen the average data from EIA over the last couple of years. Chris, if you have a couple facts or figures as far as where things have gone over these last few years, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we have a figure in a recent working paper that plots every state going back to 1998. As Ryan was saying, the states with the highest growth over this time period there's a lot of Western states there. So just to give you an idea, from 1998 to 2024, rates in California went up by 3 times. And you're seeing that also similar increases to that in Massachusetts and Hawaii and Rhode Island and Oregon. So very blue Western states. You do see increases in some very red states. Actually, West Virginia has, over that time period, had the 8th highest increase, again, from 1998. So it is across the political spectrum, but we're talking about 3-time increases in electricity rates over a 26-year period.
And Ryan, I've seen the EIA data that's showing, rates getting up near a national average around 18 cents. It was really not that long ago when they were 13. That's 35, 40% type rate increases just in the last few years. Is there any other figures you would want to get out there just as a baseline?
Yeah, I think in some of the work, again, that we did with LBNL, I think looking at a more recent time period than Chris was mentioning, from 2019 to 2025, just within that, 5 or 6 year period, residential rates on average increased by 33%. So again, I think a pay in nominal terms, so a pace that customers just aren't used to experiencing.
Yeah, perfect. Well, let's pivot. Let's talk about what's causing all of this. And so I kind of ask this almost as a peel the onion back or a snowball sort of question. Christopher, maybe you can start with us. What is putting pressure to cause rates going up? What's that first thing that comes to mind? And then Ryan, I'll let you add something to that, and we'll keep kind of going until we exhaust the areas that we think are the critical ones.
Yeah, so that's the topic of the recent working paper that I just mentioned, where we try to think hard, or at least use empirical methods to try to disentangle what's driving these rates. And our results suggest, at least, that actually rooftop solar is a big driver of rate increases over this time period. And some of that is mechanical. So the way we price electricity coming from rooftop solar. So if I have a panel on my roof and I'm exporting that power, so I'm generating more power than my home is consuming, then I get paid the full retail rate of that in that state or in that location.
The old net metering debate.
Yeah, exactly. And that retail rate includes paying for the wires. So if I'm not paying for the wires anymore, somebody else has to. And the way mechanically that works is we have to raise the rates on everyone else. And that's consistent with our empirical results. I think that's the headline number.
Can I ask a little follow-on question on that? I mean, when you see the levelized cost of energy of, solar, it's often a very cost-effective
Yeah.
resource. So kind of like, how do those two things square? I don't know if you have a simple answer to that.
Yeah, I think they square by the levelized cost of energy is the generation of energy, electrons. But your rate pays for both the electrons and the wires. So if that solar panel owner is not paying for the wires, someone else has to pay for them, even though they're injecting electrons that are really cheap to generate, but they're getting out of paying for the wires, and somebody else has to pay for those wires, and then that ends up increasing the rates on everyone else.
Ryan, what would you add?
There are a lot. I hope I get the answer right, Bryce. But the one that I often like to mention is one that I think is generally an underappreciated driver, and also one of the drivers that is kind of one of the most widespread drivers nationally of what we're seeing in terms of price increases. And that is the cost of just needing to go out and replace aging equipment on the distribution system. We're at a point where significant portions of the distribution grid are 80 years old and they need to be replaced. And unfortunately, that need to replace this equipment is coming right at a time when a lot of that equipment has gotten very expensive. There are supply chain constraints that still haven't been fully resolved coming out of the pandemic that have led to the cost of some of this power systems equipment rising way faster than inflation over the last 5 or 6 years. And so we kind of have this perfect storm of needing to go out and make replacements just to maintain the level of reliability that we're used to right at a time when that stuff has gotten more expensive. That is I think, the hidden story here, but it is also one that a lot of states are experiencing. And unfortunately, I don't see that going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I call this the pay the piper cost. You need the system, and you're eventually going to need to replace it, and we're having to pay it at a time, as you had said, when we're really in a crunch. So you combine two of them that I had in my list. Christopher, is there another aspect here that comes to mind for you that's driving these pressures up?
Yeah, and Ryan brought this up earlier. We have other work that suggests or finds evidence that climate change is a driver of electricity prices as well. And that comes through the channel of having to either beef up the system or underground wires, or just replace wires that have been destroyed by hurricanes and so on. So we're kind of getting hit through all from all sides. And, it's amazing we've gone this far without also talking about data centers. That's certainly the fear is that data center demand will be putting upward pressure on electricity prices as well.
Let's hang tight on the load growth one, but Ryan, I thought you might start on the resilience investments one because of how significant, for example, those wildfire mitigation investments are costing. But maybe you can just dive a little further on that same one that Christopher was on.
Yeah, I know there are kind of two categories of that. One is the proactive investment that you're making to try and harden the grid to prepare yourself for more extreme weather, storms, hurricanes, wildfires, undergrounding, and the other measures that Chris was describing. That's a significant cost driver. And then there's also the cost of needing to go out and repair or replace significant portions of the grid that get taken out when those disasters occur, right? So we've talked a lot about wildfires in the West. There's also hurricane risk in portions of the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, extreme weather events in the winter that are becoming more severe. And so you do see states and utilities needing to deal with this on both a proactive and a reactive basis.
So Christopher, I guess I'll target my question to you on the supply chain impacts and maybe get your reaction on how durable you think those are. But I guess I'd also lump in, labor's not going down. So, how do those cost inputs kind of find their way into the equation for affordability right now? And do you think they're durable?
Well, so on the specific supply chain constraints. If you want to build a combined cycle gas turbine right now, it's going to take you 4 or 5 years before you
Get
can
in
get it.
line.
And even substations and transformers are really hard to come by these days. So there are real supply chain constraints. How durable those are, I think it varies. I would imagine that substations and transformer supply chain constraints are going to go away because we're going to need a lot of those. Everyone agrees we're going to need a lot of those. So there's going to be entry into that business. But when I talk with gas turbine manufacturers, they're not quite sure whether they want to expand capacity or not, right? Because they're worried that they'll expand capacity and 2 years from now there'll be a Democrat in the Oval Office, and that'll all be sunk investments. So those might stick around until we have some better idea of what the future generation mix is going to be. And until we are pretty confident there's going to be a lot of gas or not, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in that business.
So I don't know which of you wants to take this one, but it seemed like we were kind of steadily marching up towards more compliance and regulatory and environmental requirements, and those adding to costs. And then, in the last maybe 15 or so months, a bazooka was attempted to be taken to swipe as many of those out. But is that a significant aspect to costs right now? Would either of you say?
You're asking about the kind of the cost or lack of cost associated with clean energy policies broadly, Bryce?
Yeah, or any compliance requirements or, permitting requirements, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of on the broader topic of renewable portfolio standards and the cost that could be associated with that. I think Chris's research and some of the work that we were involved in with LB&L have drawn slightly different conclusions there. I think partly explainable due to just kind of differences in methodologies in terms of how we were looking at the data. I think when we looked at the cost of renewable portfolio standards, something that we saw was that based on the kind of information that was available from the states that were implementing those policies, that there was some modest upward pressure being associated with requiring utilities to go out and procure clean energy above and beyond what would be normally procured through the market. Not particularly significant in most states. I think on average it was something like 1/4 cent per kilowatt hour, but we did identify some modest upward pressure associated with that. But I think the reason for that is a lot of the policymakers that are going in and establishing those policies recognize the cost of climate change that we were just describing, right? And understand that if we're going to address that in the long run, we need to reduce our dependence on natural gas, improve the diversity of our resource mix, and focus more on promoting clean energy. So that was our conclusion. But Chris, I'm sure you'll want to talk about your research as well.
Yeah. So to your question, Bryce, it's certainly easier and cheaper to run a gas plant now or a coal plant than it was under the Biden administration, which is making those plants more profitable to run. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see a lot of investment in new gas and coal plants, because these are 20, 30, 40-year investments. And those investors are making guesses as to what's going to happen over that entire time frame. So I think what we're seeing is, some coal plants that would have shut down are not shutting down. Some nuclear plants, same thing. And that's coming partly because of the deregulation that this administration has been undergoing.
So I got one last, unless you guys want to add any other things, and it is the new load growth. So we're in an era where 0 to 0.5% might have been pretty common for load growth. And now you got places saying, well, we think we might have maybe 5 or 8% load growth. And so often driven by data centers and large facilities. But, is this a driver of the cost serving this new demand?
I'll jump in not to talk about data centers because Chris called that one, so he gets to respond first. I just wanted to add one other point while we were on the topic of gas generation. And that is the price of natural gas itself as a fuel for those generators. To us, that's more of a story of price volatility than it is necessarily one of a consistent upward trend in the price of natural gas. But that, because the U.S. is so dependent on natural gas as a generation source, over 50% of generation coming from gas gas plants. That is a significant driver of electricity prices. And what we saw when we looked just at the recent uptick in electricity prices between 2024 and 2025, one of the most significant drivers of that very, very recent price increase was an increase in the price of natural gas. So when you see fluctuations in gas prices, that finds its way directly into customer rates and customer bills. And volatility, I think, from a behavioral standpoint, can be experienced by customers as a price increase, even if on average you're just kind of bouncing around the same mean. So
Yeah, and if I could add to that, because it's interesting that we are building a lot more export capacity to export that natural gas to other parts of the world, which may or may not be a good thing. I'm not, but from a domestic natural gas price impact, it's just going to expose us to more volatility as we see, what natural gas prices are doing now during the Iran war or when Russia invaded Ukraine. We were and have been effectively insulated to a large degree from that. But as we build out that export capacity, we'll be less and less insulated, which will be an interesting policy topic going forward.
Well, fuel price volatility, great addition. But Christopher, if you don't mind, what sort of impact is serving new load having on prices? I would imagine we haven't seen a lot of that impact, but is it coming around the corner?
Yeah, I think it's potentially coming around the corner. You're right. We haven't seen much evidence of the impact yet. There has been some empirical work that links wholesale electricity prices to data center growth. But this data center growth is no joke. A year ago when I taught a class on data centers, I kind of downweighted the prospects, but then we saw InRail come out and almost double their projections of data center growth. And now what's interesting about this is there is a way where data center growth could actually lower rates. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it comes back to something we talked about earlier, which is half of running an electricity market is paying for the grid, the wires. So if data centers can grow the average consumption by more than the peak consumption, then we won't have to invest a lot more in the wires, and we'll get to spread those wire costs over more kilowatt hours of electricity. So at least theoretically, load growth can be good to the average customer if it's growing, like I said, the average faster than the growth. But that depends on incentives and, either hardwiring in policies or providing financial incentives for those data centers to not add to our peak. And I haven't seen that yet, but there's certainly the prospect of controlling the costs increases that we might see from data centers through better rate structures or more carrot and stick type policies.
Well, we could have a whole conversation on that, and we may later this season.
Yeah.
But it's a perfect transition into, all right, we're here. Rates are growing up for a lot of reasons. What do we do? So let's do a similar exercise on what can be done to address the fact that rates are ballooning and may continue to increase. Ryan, maybe you can, start, and then we'll bat back and forth between you guys. Like, okay, what can we do?
Yeah, and I will probably pick up where Chris left off here, which is, if we've moved out of this kind of historical world that we were in, where there was significant available capacity on the system to accommodate new load growth and spread those fixed costs across more customers and put downward pressure on rates. I think the question we're asking now is, when we look forward, do we have options to recreate that type of opportunity or those types of conditions on the system? And what I see as being one of the really big opportunities there is demand flexibility or virtual power plants, right? And that can come in a few different flavors. One is asking data centers themselves to be flexible, to bring their own load onto the system in a way that increases like average sales without proportionally increasing peak demand. Or it can be to ask to provide other customers with financial incentives to create that headroom on the system by reducing their demand during peak hours. And so I think there's this really interesting model that is emerging. Google and Voltus just announced a deal earlier this week where Google is going to come in and effectively pay customers to reduce demand to create capacity on the system to accommodate load growth. And that model, in my view, has really the potential to transform the demand side of the industry when you think about the resources that companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft can be bringing to this problem.
And as complex as that solution is, maybe let me just try to simplify and reiterate why it's putting downward rate pressure, because the demand side programs cost less than the capacity addition alternatives, right? So it's just a more cost-effective solution of meeting peak supply. I heard you say yes, but anything else to that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what it allows you to do is serve that new load at a lower cost, at a cost that is lower than the revenue that that new load is paying into the system.
Right.
You're getting more revenue than you are cost, so they're buying down the cost of the system for existing customers.
So Christopher, from a solution area, where do you want to start? What can we do?
Yeah, so I'll second everything that Ryan said, but I'll jump on my soapbox that I've been on for the last couple months, and I'm about to drop a kind of primer on how we price electricity. So I encourage people to read it, but I think we need to rethink how we price electricity generally. And it gets at some of what Ryan is talking about, that we are not sending the signals to customers to reduce their demand during peak periods. So the title of the paper is, smart meters, dumb prices, right? Like our prices, the way we price electricity are based on the meters that we had 50 years ago, right? They couldn't tell you when you were consuming the electricity. They couldn't communicate back to the utility. We now have the ability to price electricity on an hourly basis. So when the system is in scarcity, consumers should see that, and that will incentivize them to reduce their demand. And I'll go back to something else that we were talking about, which is we've also been wrapping in a lot of costs into the per kilowatt hour charge to customers that do not vary by kilowatt hour. And those are the grid costs, but also a bunch of policy costs. If I look at my bill, on a per kilowatt hour basis, I'm paying for solar programs. I'm paying for electric vehicle programs. These are all effectively fixed costs to my bill, at least. And that's a policy choice. We've decided to wrap them into a bill, into a rate for electricity that is adding on to low-income household bills in a very bad way these days.
Do you have a favorite time of use rate structure? I know that customer behavior isn't always logical, so often the ones that start making behavioral changes kind of have big differences between peak and trough, and often we're trying to encourage people to use power when it's available, like nights and evenings, and discourage it on a peak. But what do you have a favorite version of it?
I'm an economist, card-carrying economist, so my favorite is real-time pricing. But we have recent work that shows that actually you can get really far toward that in terms of efficiency gains with only 2 or 3 prices. Believe it or not, if you just have a peak off-peak price, you can get 80% the way there.
And since we're on pricing structure, can we talk about large load tariffs? Who wants to tackle that? I know it's kind of a newer topic, but it seems like we need to address it a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. The big thing with large load tariffs is, for them at least, are capacity charges or demand charges. So, and this is also incentivizing them to curb their peak usage. So they should be on real-time prices generally. I think most industrial and large commercial establishments should be. And then they should have a second component of their bill, which depends on their peak coincident demand. So if they're using a lot of electricity when the system is using a lot of electricity, then they should pay for that.
Brian, anything else on the rate structure and tariffs?
Yeah, I think aside from using the tariff to create an incentive for the data centers themselves to be flexible, I think the other important aspect of that is this is just a very important tool that we have available to us to insulate existing customers from the new costs that a new load like a data center would be imposing on the system. If we can get the prices right and recover those new incremental costs from the data centers, that should be a tool that doesn't necessarily on its own reduce rates for other customers, but it prevents rates from being increased for other customers. And then the question, kind of the policy question, is how much further beyond that do we want to go? And you are seeing data centers starting to announce as part of settlement processes or things that they're even just volunteering to do, agreeing to basically pay into a fund for low-income weatherization assistance or bill assistance that goes above and beyond paying for the cost that they're imposing on the grid to try and lead to beneficial outcomes for customers. Like, that seems to be the direction we're heading in right now. That concept has momentum, and I think that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
What's the next thing you would suggest throwing into the mix as a part of the solution set, Ryan? Anything that comes to mind?
To me, conceptually, I think it is just, this is the time for utilities and regulators to embrace innovation. It has been a relatively, conservative, slow-moving industry, and the rate of load growth has allowed us to move at that pace. That's not the case anymore. And so I think, kind of my parting message, if we're at that point in the podcast, would be... Oh,
we got more. We're still going.
We got more? Okay. Well, yeah. I'll put in a plug for it anyway. I think when I was mentioning the bring your own distributed capacity model, I think, making sure that the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good, and we find a way to make that work without necessarily needing to get it right to 4 decimal places of precision is going to be important, or else this opportunity is going to pass us by, and we'll have built all the generation to serve the new load and won't have done all this exciting stuff on the demand side.
Tired of costly grid upgrades and unpredictable demand? Virtual Peaker's AI-powered virtual power plant software empowers utilities to maximize the value of distributed energy resources. The cutting-edge platform optimizes DER operations, enhances grid stability, and unlocks new revenue streams. Learn more at virtual-peaker.com. Now back to our episode.
We talked about this before. I don't know if you guys have a direct point on it, but making the necessary investments and not delaying. I mean, it seems that costs always go up if you delay those investments. Do you have any kind of reaction to kind of keeping up with the backlog of necessary grid investments? I know, Ryan, you talked about kind of how a lot of the costs are coming from the distribution side of the grid now.
Yeah, no, it is. What you just described is kind of, I think, this concept of proactive grid planning or proactive grid build out, right? We have seen, in California in particular, the investor-owned utilities have kind of started to become the bottleneck that is preventing the state from achieving some of its transportation electrification goals, because the build out of the distribution system can't keep up with the demand for building out, charging hubs for fleets of electric vehicles. And so it's kind of to some extent, kind of the opposite of trying to focus on improving grid utilization. It's this concept of going out, and if you're pretty confident that load is going to be growing at a significant trajectory in some location, overbuilding the grid a little bit, because that can be more cost efficient than going out and marginally upgrading a substation and then 2 years later needing to go out and do that again, right? So I think my takeaway from a lot of this is there will be opportunities and locations where focusing on improving grid utilization makes sense. There will be opportunities and locations where proactive grid planning makes sense. And those aren't necessarily contradictory. It's just different solutions for different problems, basically.
And then, Christopher, maybe I'll ask you this one. I mean, I think aligning incentives is always absolutely critical to get the outcomes that you're looking for. And we all want cost-effective delivered power. Maybe operators don't want to prioritize dynamic line rating, but how do we get the aligned incentives so that the efforts that are done are the ones that give us the most cost-effective energy system? Do you have any perspectives on this?
Yeah, generally we obviously, and maybe this is too obvious, but you have to send the right incentives or signals. I think one of the problems with technologies like dynamic line rating is potentially that we have big utilities that get paid based on their capital stock. So there's going to be an incentive to build new lines before squeezing out everything that we can get from the existing lines. There's been some proposed legislation that tries to move in that direction by trying to give the utilities some of the benefits from grid enhancing technologies and so on. So it's going to come through those incentives. A lot of people talk about how much more we could squeeze out of the existing grid, and it would be great to see that actually be factual.
Well, thank you guys for exploring that. There is more, but I think we got to a lot of the key levers there. We're running a little bit long, but I want to ask two questions. Ryan, maybe you can start on this one. Affordability has always been an outcome that we've wanted on the grid system, but it always comes with trade-offs. So given the current dynamics now, how do you balance affordability with resilience, affordability with reliability, affordability with safety, affordability with flexibility? You can keep going down the list. How are stakeholders trying to balance affordability with the other things we want to achieve?
Yeah, it kind of comes back to my point from a minute ago when I jumped the gun and made my pitch for innovation, right? Like, I do see virtual power plants as being a solution to several of those problems at once. They can be a more cost-effective option than conventional investment in infrastructure. They also can be clean if we're talking about energy efficiency or distributed batteries paired with solar. And they can help to achieve some of our electrification goals as well if we're talking about flexibly interconnecting fleets of electric vehicles. So it does require us to think about the power system a little differently than we have historically. But I do see VPPs and flexibility on the demand side as being a solution that can check several of those boxes simultaneously for utilities and regulators.
Chris, how about you on the balance topic?
Yeah, since Ryan went back to something he said earlier, I'll do the same. I agree. It's about flexibility in the grid, and the question is how to best get that. And I'll go back to the rate structure. Like we're not sending the right signals to consumers to conserve when it's most important to conserve. So we need to rethink how we price electricity.
Christopher, Ryan, thanks for being on with us. This was a great and lively discussion, and we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thanks for having us.
It was great to be with you.
Thanks again to our season sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Pulse, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.